welcome you all to the Thomas Jefferson Center's annual celebration of Constitution Day. And we are thus helping the University of Texas to fulfill its obligation under federal law, which holds that every public university in the United States must hold some kind of intellectual celebration each year of Constitution Day. And here it is at the University of Texas. And this year, we're especially privileged to have as our speaker Phillip Muñoz, who is the Tocqueville professor in the Department of Political Science and concurrently professor of law at the University of Notre Dame. He's a leading teacher and scholar of American political thought, and not least of the founding and of the founding fathers. His writings include the books God and the Founders, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson, Religious Liberty and the American Supreme Court, and most recently, Religious Liberty and the American Founding. And he'll speak to us today on what should we celebrate when we celebrate the 4th of July. Professor Muñoz.
Well, good afternoon. You can hear me okay? Okay. Thank you especially to Tom Pangol and to Lorraine and to Devin and Dana Stauffer and everyone at the Jefferson Center for hosting me. I have many friends here at Texas. I've spent some time here myself, and it's a pleasure to be back. You know, Texas has one of the best, if not the best, political theory programs in the country, so it's a real honor to be here. You know, I've particularly in my mind is Lorraine today, and I'm sorry she can't be here, but you know, she's certainly in my prayers, and I know all of her thoughts. So I had just a few years ago, I met Lorraine really I mean, I've known who she is for years, and we met at the Southern Political Science Conference and had a phenomenal dinner and have been corresponding since. And in a way, this lecture comes from an article, and this article proceeds from a series of conversations I had with Lorraine. So it's a criticism of Tom. So. That's more true than you might think. Yeah. Okay. Today, not everyone is eager to celebrate the Declaration of Independence. The political left has long been skeptical of 1776, as you know. That critique is familiar. All men are created equal did not really mean all men. It didn't include women. It didn't include African Americans. The Constitution follows from the Declaration, didn't secure rights or protected slavery. The founders really meant to cover or protect their own economic oligarchic interests. That's the thesis of Charles Beard, the famous progressive historian. But there's a new criticism, a criticism from the right that's emerged in recent years. Liberalism has failed because liberalism succeeded, my friend and colleague Pat Deneen argues. About natural rights, Alistair McIntyre, arguably the most well-known, if not the most profound, Notre Dame professor of philosophy who passed away just a few months ago. This is what McIntyre in his famous book After Virtue said about rights, natural rights. He says, the truth is plain. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns. That's what Notre Dame's most famous professor thinks of the Declaration of Independence. The political philosophy of the American founding erodes traditional morality, the critique goes, undermines sound religious belief, and undermines all that is good and noble. That's the post-liberal critique. So I think the left is wrong about the Declaration of Independence, and the right is wrong about the founding. At least that's what I'm going to argue today. Here's the thesis I want to argue. The American founding was animated by a revolution in political thinking, a revolution that was not hostile to religion or religious truth. The natural rights political philosophy of the American founding, which includes all human beings, black as well as white, men as well as women, places limits on political authority in recognition of and out of deference to legitimate religious authority. I'm going to advance this thesis by articulating what I call the three revolutions of 1776. Now, just a word of patience for some of you. This lecture is primarily written for the undergraduates here, as I was asked to do. There are a few things for the graduate students and the faculty as well. So when I get to those points, just remember even Aristotle publicly disagreed with Plato. Okay. My first revolution. First revolution pertains to the foundations of political authority. America begins with the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. But equal in what respects? And how do we know? What is the significance of this equality? Let's see if this works now. Good. Okay. Jefferson himself explained the meaning of equality, at least as he understood it, a few days before he died in this remarkable letter to Roger Waitman. Do you know the story of Jefferson's passing, you undergraduates? You undergraduates, or the graduate students too, have you seen this, I think it's an HBO miniseries, John Adams, came out, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago? How many of you have seen it? It's quite good, right? I don't know anything about the people who made it, but it's a phenomenally well done and historically accurate miniseries. I recommend it to you. Anyways, the two men most responsible for the Declaration of Independence are John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams, because he was so George Washington is the indispensable man, but George Washington is out leading the troops in battle, right? The fighting starts in 1775. Adams is the individual most responsible for getting the colonial leaders, the elite, to sign the Declaration of Independence, to declare independence. If you sign the Declaration, that's an act of what? Of treason. And what's the punishment for treason? For death. Not an easy thing to persuade your fellows to do. So Adams does more than anyone else to persuade the leading colonists to declare independence. Thomas Jefferson, of course, writes the Declaration of Independence. It's a great credit to Adams that, in a way, it was Adams' right, or it would be natural that Adams would have written the Declaration of Independence, but he understood Thomas Jefferson would do a better job than him, which is true, if you've ever read John Adams. So these two men are the men most responsible for the Declaration of Independence. They both die on July 4, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, that brings us back to this letter. Sorry, I'm one behind. Okay, so Roger Waitman is the mayor of Washington, D.C. The nation is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in Pennsylvania. So Waitman, who's organizing the celebration, writes to Jefferson and says, can you join us in Philadelphia? Now, this is 2 weeks before he dies, less than 2 weeks before he dies. We used to think this was the last letter Jefferson ever wrote, which would have been beautiful and poetic on the Declaration of Independence. And I asked about it at Monticello. Now, I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is true. This is just what I was told by the tour guide. I asked about the letter to Waitman, his last letter, and she said, oh, no, that's not the last letter. We found another letter recently, she said. And I'm like, well, what's the letter that he wrote? Thinking this would be, a scholarly find. And she says, it was about his wine collection, which, if you know anything about Jefferson, that's very believable, yeah. So it's the penultimate letter. In the letter, Jefferson says, look, I can't travel to Philadelphia to be with at the celebration. He doesn't say, but he effectively says, I'm about to die. And he writes the letter, which he knows is going to be made public. He writes the letter for the people of America, but he writes the letter for you students. He's writing it for all of us. This is Jefferson's last word on the meaning of the Declaration. Okay, let me just read you a bit of it, right? All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth. The mass of mankind have not been born with saddles on their back, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. To understand what Jefferson is saying here, you have to work through the metaphor. So horses aren't born with saddles on their back, right? But most people say it's legitimate. So what do you do when you, I mean, maybe this happens here in Texas. You know, you're like walking to campus and you see walk into your class through campus and you come across a wild horse. And you're like, oh, I'll ride that horse, right? But what do you have to do to the horse so you can ride it? What do you do to it? What's that? You tame it. You break it, right? Yes? We're allowed to say that still, right? You break the horse. What are you breaking? Or what are you taming?
Its sense of independence.
Okay. It's will, right? Right? Is it just that you do that?
Yeah, I would say no, but also yes.
No, but yes. What's your name?
Chance.
Chance. Are you a philosophy major? Yeah. Most normal people would say, yeah, it's a horse, right? I can ride the horse.
But what gives you the right to ride a horse?
Do you think you can't ride a horse?
I know if I were to get on them right now, it would fall on my face. But
Well, that's just because you're incompetent, not because you're, no, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But, do you have a pet?
yes,
A dog?
yes.
Is it right that you own a dog?
At the same time, again, yes, but actually no.
Yeah, okay. Is this your buddy?
We're in class together.
What's your name?
Will it?
William? Okay, what's your dog's name?
I have 4. So.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a concession that you think it's right that you can own a dog. Okay? Wait, give me one of your dog's names.
Katie. We'll go with Katie.
Katie. So you can own Katie. Katie the puppy. Can you own William, your classmate?
13th Amendment says no.
Do you actually believe that you need that if there wasn't the 13th Amendment, could you own William?
Personally, I would not based off of
That's just your opinion?
I mean, legality holds back.
If it was William's opinion that he could own you, would you say that's okay?
No.
Yeah, you wouldn't. No person would. But every sensible person would say, it's okay for you to own your puppy Katie. Why? Because there's an order of nature. That order is in nature. It's not that we legislate that order, the 13th Amendment. It's in nature. And that's what Jefferson is saying. So if you think through what he's saying, there are no man, no human being can treat another human being legitimately like a human being can treat a dog or an animal. There's an order of nature, and that order teaches all men are created equal. No man by nature is a master, and no man by nature is a slave. It also means that no man by nature is a king or queen, and no man by nature is a subject. Okay. Just to give one other example, right? If William is out is riding his horse, which he's tamed, and he's out in the middle of some orchard, and he's hungry, and he reaches up and picks an apple, no one owns the apple tree. Whose apple is it?
Whomever owns the orchard.
Yeah, no one owns the orchard. It's just a wild apple. William. Right? Because he owns his own labor. He put his labor into it. Right? Who said so?
God.
Okay, well, maybe. Okay. I mean, could be. But the fact that we each own our own labor. Let me explain this at another point. How many of you have kids? Anyone have kids? Okay, this is what's going to happen when you have kids. Mrs. Stauffer raised her hand, and Mr. Stauffer was uncertain if he should or not. This is what's going to happen if you have kids. You're going to buy your kids many presents, and they're going to play with the boxes that the presents come in. And then they're going to put their presents away and forget about them and not care about them, and you're going to throw the boxes away. And then several months later, you're going to invite your friends over, and the friends have kids your kids' age. And those kids, your friends' kids, are going to come in the house, and what are your friends' kids going to want to do? They're going to play with that toy, which your kid never played with. And as soon as your friend's kid picks up that toy, what is your kid going to say? Mine. Now, did they get that from the Bible? I guarantee you your kids will do this to you. Every kid does. And it's not because they've read Locke, but they are natural Lockeans, because they believe they own your labor. Sort of not consistent with what I've just said, but nonetheless, there's something in human nature that says we each own our own labor, but we can own the labor of an animal. You can own a dog, and you can own the dog's labor, or a horse. That's all in nature, okay? Everything I've just said is in that one or two sentences of Jefferson, okay? Now, it's not just Jefferson who makes this argument. Other founders make it differently. So I want to go through one other argument. This is a quote from James Wilson. Anyone know who James Wilson is? I know it's the Jefferson Center. So. Okay. James Wilson is he's extraordinarily important, especially in Pennsylvania. He's sort of one of the leading founders, along with Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, is one of, I think, 6 individuals to sign the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. One of the first Supreme Court justices, played a very important role in the ratification debates, especially in Pennsylvania. But James Wilson, he's a AAA founder. Never quite made it up to the major leagues. In 1790, he starts giving a series of lectures. They're called the Lectures on Law. And they're, 800, 1,000 pages long. This is one of his problems. If he had written a 200-page book, you'd all know who he is. But he was too verbose. But in this book, more carefully than any other founder, I think, he gives an account of human equality. And he ties human equality from human nature. Okay? What does he say? He says, look at nature, right? Nature has implanted in man a desire for his own happiness. She's inspired him with many tender affections towards others. Friends, we desire our own happiness. We have natural care for our friends and family. We have our natural impulses, our intellectual and moral powers. He says, look at human nature. What do you find? He says, a result of looking at human nature, let me quote here, the undeniable consequence is that he, man, human beings, has a right to exert his powers for the accomplishment of those purposes and in such a manner upon such objects as his inclinations and judgment shall direct, provided he do no injury to others, provided some public interests do not demand his labor. This right is natural liberty. Every man has a sense of this right. Every man has a sense of the impropriety of restraining it. Wilson says, look at what we are. Look at human nature. Human beings are a being that's meant to be free. This is why we bristle, especially when we're teenagers. Right? You're not actually you're actually not an adult yet. You're not quite there, but you know you want to be there. And authority seems especially difficult then. That actually reflects something in human nature. The important thing to note here is that Wilson doesn't just point to the low, to our desire for self-preservation or gratification. He also points to the high, to our abilities, especially our rational abilities. In our voluntary actions, he says, consist our dignity and our perfection. The most essential thing about human beings, according to Wilson, is that we can know what is right and wrong, apprehend it, reason it out, and choose to do what is right. And that distinguishes us from the animals. That is why he says, this is actually one of the only instances in the time of the founding where they use the phrase dignity in the sense of human dignity. It's in our liberty. The founders distinguished liberty from license. License, you could say, is the misuse of freedom, or using freedom to do things you shouldn't do. Liberty is the proper use of freedom. Now, man is, of course, capable of licentiousness, but he's also the being capable or meant for liberty. Those capacities, Wilson reasons, are the grounds of our natural right to freedom. So human freedom, the right to freedom, is grounded in our nature, both what is low and what is high, but especially what is high in our nature. Reflecting on human nature, our natural desires, affections, inclinations, and especially our intellectual and moral capacities, leads Wilson, and it's not just Wilson, this is the common sense of the founders, to the conclusion that all human beings are equal. So it's worth emphasizing, or I want to emphasize, that Jefferson and Wilson's account of human nature and natural liberty, they're not Hobbesian. Unlike Hobbes, the founders do not ground rights solely in the passions, especially the singular passion of the fear of violent death. Unlike Hobbes, they do not take natural liberty to mean we are free to do anything. Immediately after articulating man's natural right of, his right of natural liberty, Wilson makes clear that this is not a right to commit moral wrong. The laws of nature are the measure and the rule. That is, nature both grounds our rights and limits our rights. Natural rights are part of the natural law. The natural law is just the law of reason. The law of reason bounds natural rights. Natural rights are part of the natural law, which means there's no natural right to trespass the law of nature. Okay. Wilson articulates the framer's basic moral framework of natural rights. Our natural desire for our happiness and that of our friends, and our capacities to pursue happiness in light of our abilities to distinguish right from wrong, mean that all human beings have a right to natural liberty. Like all natural rights, this natural right to liberty is bound by the natural moral law. That all human beings by nature equally possess the right to exercise dominion over their own lives has a specific implication for the institution of legitimate political authority. Given that no human being by nature has a right to govern another, legitimate political authority arises via consent. While it might be in every man's interest to be a citizen of a decent political order, given every individual's right of natural liberty, no man can be bound to a specific political order except through his own consent. And so that is the first revolution. Legitimate political authority arises via consent. Just a quick example of how I try to explain this in my own classes. So imagine if this example might not be perfect. Imagine that you're 17 and you're in Ukraine right now. And as soon as and this is hypothetical, this is not necessarily true, but it might not be true at all. When you turn 18, you're obligated to go fight. To go fight means you're going to be sent to the front. To be sent to the front means you're probably going to die. Now, some kids actually face this situation in Ukraine. So here's the question. Does that 17-year-old, and we use 18 as the age of maturity, where you can make your own decision. Does that 17-year-old, when he's about to turn 18, or when he turns 18, say, I renounce my citizenship, have a right to say, I renounce my citizenship, I will leave the country? That's a right to emigrate with an E. I don't think this war is just. I don't want to be a part of it. The founders would say that's a natural right. That consent, not only at the beginning, but you have a right to consent to the government into which you were born into. And so you have a right to leave should you not want to be a part of that regime. Now, if that doesn't seem right to you, think about this situation. Imagine you're not born in Ukraine, but you're born in Moscow. And you're about to turn 18, and you're about to be sent to the front. Do you have a natural obligation to stay in the country and be sent to the front? And if you say no, because maybe that individual thinks, this is an unjust war, I don't want to be a part of it. If you think an individual, that 17-year-old, has a right to make that judgment and say, no, I'll leave. I renounce my citizenship, I won't fight. The grounds of that right are equality, are natural equality, which makes legitimate political authority instituted via consent. The leading example of this right being violated, I was about to say in our times, not really in your times, it's in our times. Do you remember the Berlin Wall? Some of you, where was the Berlin Wall built? Well, in Berlin. It's not. What part of Berlin? It separated East from West Berlin. It was in East Berlin. Why did the East Germans build the Berlin Wall? To keep their people in. And we said, you're a tyranny because you won't let your people leave. If you think through that, it's because we believe legitimate government is instituted via consent. Consent follows from equality. That's the first revolution of the founders. Okay. Now for the graduate students, this is for you. Well, the recognition of human equality and the corresponding principle of legitimate government instituted via consent are in some sense modern political ideas. The founders derived them from classical metaphysical principles. The founders' reasoning presumes that human beings ought to be treated in accordance with the kind of beings we are, which is perceptible in our unique attributes and capacities. The founders adopt Thomas Aquinas' ontology, which I think might be Aristotle's ontology as well, that being and goodness are convertible terms, that human excellence is found in uncovering what we truly are. The founders, in other words, derived an ought from an is. Human beings have a right to liberty, the ought. From the is, human beings have the capacities of natural to exercise freedom. So what most distinguishes the founders from classical thinkers is not a different approach to natural right or natural law, but rather the founders' appreciation and embrace of human equality as a central aspect of nature. Now, of course, that's quite debatable. The founders, I'm arguing, are much more ancient than we are used to thinking. Okay, my second revolution. Okay, second revolution involves limiting the purposes of political authority to natural rights. Let me see, I'll do this a little bit more quickly. This is a quote from a 1792 essay by James Madison on property. Madison says, government is instituted to protect property of every sort. By property, Madison doesn't mean just land or material possessions. He says, in its larger or juster meaning, the concept of property embraces everything to which man may attach a value and have a right, and which leaves to everyone else a like advantage. Here's the important part from this passage, right at the bottom. He says, a just government is one in which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. The founders' conception of government, of just government, is different from that which took hold in America in the 20th century. Unlike influential progressives such as Herbert Crowley or political leaders such as FDR, the founders did not hold that the fundamental purpose of government is to provide directly for the material needs of the people or to ameliorate every and all unfortunate conditions, or especially to equalize material resources. The founders instead understood the role of government to secure the conditions, including the economic conditions, that would allow the American people to be responsible for themselves, to employ their natural freedom, that natural right of liberty, to provide for themselves, their families, and those under their care, perhaps even for their community. Responsibility for oneself, for one's loved ones, for one's community is the quintessential American virtue. Responsibility allows individuals who have been endowed with equal natural liberty to use their freedom well. I mean, the virtue of responsibility is an interesting one. It's not an Aristotelian virtue, but it's the quintessential American virtue. It's a modern virtue. Respect for and recognition of individuals' responsibilities for their own well-being, which includes moral responsibility to one's neighbors, to one's families, perhaps even to the community if you have those capacities, led the founders to conclude that a legitimate political community is not and cannot be tasked with securing every element of the good life. Good government primarily is tasked with protecting life, securing liberty, and defending property, because that fosters the virtue of responsibility. So the founders aim at virtue, but a different virtue, a virtue connected to the use of our freedom, which they see as natural. Okay. Perhaps most fundamentally, the founders held that government is not and cannot be responsible for saving citizens' souls. Most of us take this limit for granted today, but this was truly a revolution in the understanding of the purposes of government. And this brings me to the third revolution. Third revolution is that the founders limited the role of the state out of recognition of the existence of religious truth and the legitimacy of religious authority. Political freedom and limitations on the state's authority do not imply indifference to religion. Politics must remain limited because of the nature of religious truth and in recognition of the proper domain of religious authority. Here, the founders stand in stark contrast to those who say our politics must be neutral towards religion or any comprehensive conception of the good. Such neutrality is said to be a central tenet of liberalism and a prerequisite for any sensible form of church-state politics, especially in a time of deep pluralism. The founders disagreed. The founders stand in contrast also to those who hold the grounds of our rights as primarily our passions, in particular our passion for self-preservation. Okay, so what am I saying here? The founders start with a truth. This is in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the quote on the right. Religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be only directed by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The founders didn't quite put it this way, but I think we can say, consistent with their thought, an omniscient and omnipotent Creator who created us with the capacity to adore Him, perhaps even to love Him, to love the Creator, would settle for nothing less than our full devotion. Okay, that sounds really abstract. How can I explain that? I'm not sure if this works, but let me try it this way. Will, right? Will, okay, Will. Okay. Will, imagine you met here at UT, right? Sort of the woman of your dreams. She's perfect, whatever those dreams are. Beautiful, she's virtuous, and she says, Will, I'll always be faithful to you. I'm happy, I'm willing to marry you, but I'll never love you. Ever. Would you marry her? Probably not. Yeah. I mean, there are some circumstances where you might. You know, she's really rich. Sorry. She's pregnant. You know, maybe. I mean, that's, it's a difficult one. But probably not, right? Assuming there's no extraneous conditions like that. Probably not. Why not? Something's missing, right? What is it that's missing?
Reciprocal devotion.
Yeah, some sort of devotion. What is that devotion? What does that signify? What do we mean by that? We have to think through that. When you say, especially in a marital context, I love you, that's why I'm marrying you, what are you saying? Aren't you saying, or shouldn't you be saying, I will give everything I have to you, all of me? Isn't that what you're saying? If that's not what you're saying, isn't that what you want when you get married? Someone who will give everything to you. Why do you want that? Why don't you just satisfy with, I'll be faithful to you? Because we want everything. Why do we want everything? You think, why do you want everything? Well, because human beings can give everything. What does that mean about the worship we owe to our Creator? If we want everything because of how we've been created, wouldn't the Creator, assuming that we have an obligation to worship, that we've been created in the way we have been created, isn't it right to presume that the Creator would want everything we can give to Him? And if we wouldn't settle for less, why would the Creator settle for less? No, I've said nothing about the Bible or Scripture. This is what the founders were thinking. And it's taken from natural theology, that is, from philosophical reasoning, starting from what we are, just like we went through with James Wilson. Given what we are, this must be true about religion. But if this is true about religion, religious worship, just like marriage, can only be entered into freely. Because you cannot be coerced to love anyone, including the Creator. If worship must be free, true worship cannot be brought about by state authority, which in its essence is coercion. Everyone follow that logic? And that means the state cannot pursue individual salvation. That's the third revolution. Let's see, I should start to wrap up here. Let me just skip right all the way to the end. Okay. Because political authority does not possess the mandate of divine authority, it must be founded on principles accessible to human reason, above all to the truth that all men have been created equal, and therefore legitimate government arises via consent. That's the first revolution. This basic revolution in political right, the second revolution being the purpose of government is to protect our rights, the third revolution being that government can't pursue religious salvation for us. Okay, I should say, just let me say one, I skipped something I should have said. That government doesn't possess religious authority or authority over our souls. We limit government. Who does possess religious authority then? Well, individuals in their obligations to worship, and then whatever divine authorities the Creator may create. Limiting the state's authority leaves to individuals and religious institutions their rightful authorities. This is what I mean by the limiting of the state is not neutral towards religion or hostile to religious truth. Indeed, it's premised on a natural religious truth, and it's respectful of the rightful domain of religious authority. Okay. I said something about religious authority. Religious authorities must be, to use our language, voluntary institutions. Whatever authority the Catholic Church or another church has that may come directly from God, it too cannot use coercive authority. That is, individuals must be free when they enter into it. A church that aligned itself with the state, that took on the state's authority to enforce its own dogmas, that's what an establishment of religion is, would be violating the principles of religious truth and our natural right to liberty. I can talk more about that if you want. Okay. These three revolutions are the legacy with which the signers of the Declaration of Independence pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. We honor their legacy and accept our rightful patrimony as Americans by understanding these revolutionary principles. Principles that, at least in my opinion, still make America, in Lincoln's words, the last best hope on earth. Principles that make the Declaration of Independence, at least in my conclusion, worth celebrating. Thank you very much. Can I just...
The floor is open for questions. I'll just let you handle them from there.
Sure, happy to do so. Please, tell me your name.
Oh, I'm Lauren.
Lauren?
At the end, you were talking about, I saw on the slide that parents have the authority over religious upbringing of children.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me...
So, what about infant baptisms? If you are raised into a religion when you're a child and you don't necessarily consent to it, what happens if that religion or that religious sect is abusive, or what if it's something that the child doesn't agree with?
Well, you're a child, and by nature, your parents have authority over you. So, I have 3 kids they're not infants, but they're not 18, so that they don't agree with what I say for them. They can, once they start paying rent, they can do whatever they want. So, but parents have that authority. Now you brought up another example. What if a parent abuses the child? Let's just take the simple physical abuse or something like that. Well, that's wrong. And think about, we today, I think we would all agree, if there's serious physical abuse by parents of children, not only is it terrible, one of the most terrible things that could happen, that is maybe the one time where we will take the child away from the parents. I mean, that's a serious thing, right? That natural authority, which arises via nature, the obligations of parents to their children, right? So, I'll get to this in a roundabout way. To get married, you have to go get a license, right? Like, if you guys decide after this lecture you're going to become good friends, you don't have to go get a friendship license. But if you want to get married, you have to get a marriage. Why do you have to get a marriage license? Like, from the state? Yeah, but we could arrange taxes without a license.
Is it because we find a legal perspective on the idea of marriage?
Yeah, but why do we do this? Yeah, that's true, but why?
Maintenance of social order?
Maybe. Who's the mother of the child? I mean, that's really pretty easy, right? The woman who just gave birth. Who's the father? Well, who's going to be assigned the parental responsibilities to take care of the child?
Usually the one who was involved with the conception of the child, right?
Yeah, but who's that? There's only one person who knows.
The husband or
The law presumes it's the husband. That is the person on the marriage license. So one of the reasons, a core reason, not the only reason, is to assign parental rights and responsibilities of fathers. The law assumes, whether it's true or not, the husband, that is the person on the marriage license, is the father of the children. And therefore, the father has all sorts of authorities. Is my child going to get surgery or not? this happened to my child. He had a surgery, which was not absolutely necessary, but it was a close call. Who gets to decide? Well, not the doctor. The doctor can recommend it, not the mayor. I get to decide. Why do I get to decide? Because I'm the father, along with his mother. Right? Now, that authority is natural and it's powerful, but it's not absolute. So if I abuse my child, not only can I be punished for it, that child can be taken away from me. This is natural rights all have natural limits. Okay. I'm not even sure if I answered your question here.
I think you did.
Okay.
I just wanted to make clear that this applies to physical abuse, but also spiritual abuse.
Okay, what is spiritual abuse? The question would be infant baptism, would that be spiritual abuse? Right? So it would only be, look, the child, presumably when the child is an adult, has authority of their own religious commitments. Right, that's how. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, please.
On your first slide, the first revolution of the idea of consent to govern and, for example, how the right to be immune from libel is not protected.
Uh-huh.
The right to public material is not protected. I wouldn't say I disagree.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's a bit not nuanced, but it feels like it's one lens. Because, for example, not only in the 20th century with one incorporated versus the 7th District of California, where who decides what is obscene? What decides what's obscene? It was a gay magazine.
Yeah, sure, good.
It was seen as obscene. They were punished. They were sued. They said no. We're just talking about stories. Why it's obscene? And during the revolution, during 1776, we had a gay Prussian named von Stauben who helped us, helped Washington revolutionize the Continental Army, who directly came to this country thinking that he would be allowed to practice what he saw as a love relationship, but was exiled from Prussia because of his homosexuality. So in that perspective, what figure authority, be it religious or besides that, dictates if something's obscene or not, and if that person's protected from being persecuted for that obscenity?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the First Amendment says you have the freedom of speech, okay? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Does that protect obscene materials, right? That's the question. And then how do we figure that out? And then who figures it out? Okay. The general framework, so freedom of speech is a natural right, you could say. Does that right include the dissemination of pictures, pornographic images? Okay. A question the Supreme Court struggled with a lot. Okay. The traditional understanding of natural rights is, let me just use speech, it's maybe clearer. Do you know what libel is? Libel is saying false things about someone. So you go home this evening, Professor Stauffer goes home this evening and they're talking about the lecture and he says, that was such a boring and terrible lecture. Can't believe that. That would be libelous. It would be untrue, right? Okay. So you have no right to say untrue things about someone, right? To besmirch someone's reputation, right? It's not, so the older understanding was the freedom of speech is to say anything that's reasonable. Lying about someone is not reasonable, it's quite harmful. There's no right to do wrong, we might say. There's no right to harm someone. Just like your freedom of motion doesn't mean I can, you can punch me or I can punch you. Our freedom of speech doesn't mean I can say harmful things about you. Okay, that's the structure. Then the question is, who decides what is harmful? Who decides what the boundary is? Libel is perhaps the easier case. Obscenity is less easy, or everyone says obscenity is not protected, but what is obscene? And this is where, to answer your question is, well, that's the role, first of all, of the people's representatives. Natural rights just say you have a right to free speech or a right to publish, right of freedom of press, which is the right to say or publish things in accordance with the law of nature. The difficulty with the law of nature is it's vague. You can say things that are reasonable. What's reasonable? The natural standards are vague. That's one of the reasons why we need law. to make determinations. The legal authority, in our case the legislature, makes positive law. Good positive law is what happens is that the general precepts of the natural law are translated, determined into concrete positive laws. Another simple example that would be relevant to your lives. At some point, it's not reasonable to have a loud party in your backyard. It's a Thursday night in Austin. What time do you need to be quiet? Okay, 10, maybe 11. If you live downtown, maybe midnight. Everyone agrees with the general principle. Look, you can't be too loud past a reasonable hour. Where are all the disputes? What's loud and what's reasonable? What's the reasonable hour? I would say 10 o'clock, you would say midnight. What do we need? We all agree on the same principle. Don't be too loud past a reasonable hour. What we need is a determination, a law. And when the city ordinance says 11 p.m., then when I want to quiet at 10:59, I have to say I have to wait to 11. But at 11, I can say it's time to be quiet. That's what positive law is. So the legislative branch has first responsibility. Then we can but then the executive can veto the law. That can be reviewed by judges. All of this is in the spirit of trying to make the law reasonable. Right? Does that make sense? Okay.
I want to go back to the parent thing, because the argument you made about coercion, I don't think is quite as, and faith is quite as slam dunk as you presented. So if you take a parent who raises their kid quite religiously, you could say that's an act of coercion. And the hope in that case is that the coercion will eventually lead to, the parent's hope is that the conversion will eventually lead to genuine faith. It seems to me there's a somewhat similar thing with established religions and states. The thought is not just we're going to insist on conformity, we're going to pound the faith in, but there's the thought that if we have an established religion and we use coercion, we'll also have much more genuine faith. And it seems to me that's probably true historically. I mean, I know there's some exceptions, and the U.S. is maybe a partial interesting exception. But generally speaking, you could say those places with a heavy established church probably have more genuine believers in that specific religion within them. So it doesn't seem to me simply true to say that coercion can't over time produce genuine faith. And therefore it seems to me there is a price to be paid from a religious point of view with pulling back from state-established religion.
Yeah.
The founder's choice can't simply be said to be self-evidently good for religion for that reason.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's obviously much truth in what you said. I mean, it's a little bit hard. At one point you said, in these countries with established churches, genuine faith was coerced, or coercion led to genuine faith. That's actually hard to know.
It is.
It's hard to know, right? And here we'd have to, what is the line between coercion and education? This gets at the earlier, right? So what does it mean? I mean, as a parent has certain, effectively has coercive authority because you control everything about the child's life. And you could say the state has coercive authority because it can use the force of law. When the state educates you, all of you, you're here, you obviously got through high school and grade school. Was the state coercing you in that education?
Objectively, yes. Subjectively, it's
I mean, this is what the question is getting at. What the founders are most concerned about is where the coercion can't take place is you cannot be punished, meaning punished not in the sense, you get a timeout or you don't get to use the car. You cannot be fined or thrown in jail for not going to church or for failing to profess something. That's the type of coercion they have in mind. So I think you could grant all the education, right? And the state could actually do lots that's not coercive in terms of education, that doesn't violate our natural rights. The real coercion is fines and prison, and if you don't pay your fines, it's prison, for your acts of worship or statements of belief. That's the real line, right? Now, it is true, you could say, in a regime in which you are fined for not going to church, you're likely to have more church going. That's probably true. An economist would say that's true. And if you have more church going, you may, through the act of going to church, get more actually genuine belief. It's possibly true. It still wouldn't make it right. The genuine belief, you could say, is a byproduct of the coercion, but not a direct result of the coercion. I think you just have to admit that. But I think you could still say the wrongness of coercion. Now, that's just on the level of principle. On the level of prudence, right? I mean, the part of what I skipped over, Madison's argument is actually, if you look at the history of religion and church-state relations, the more the state is intertwined with religion, the less genuine faith you actually get, and the more corruption of religion you get.
Yeah, that's what I doubt is true. So for instance, take a society like Iran.
Yeah.
You probably have more deep, genuine faith in a society like that than you do in modern day Europe. The U.S. is again a
Maybe, yeah.
complicated case. I think it's a good rhetorical argument, but I don't think it's true to the facts.
Well, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't comment on modern day Iran. It's plausible. You'd not say it's true just on the basic facts on the ground of Europe. Now, will modern day Iran become like Europe 100 or 50 or 200 years from now? I mean, we don't know. I don't know. I don't know that I can do much more than that. It is certainly true, I think. I mean, if we really wanted to pursue this question, I think you'd have to say, when can the state be like a parent in effect? Like if you raise your kid Catholic or whatever, the kid's going to stay Catholic, right? It's especially true in times of no religious diversity, so before the Protestant Reformation, great homogeneity, and probably great illiteracy. And I think the more literacy, the more religious diversity, right, the more freedom, the less effective coercion is going to be. I don't know, you'd have to put social scientists on that, but I think that's what you would find. I think that's what 20th century Europe reveals. Yeah. Either, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to clarify something you said earlier, because you said that basically that it's wrong for the government to coerce people to believe in religion, but that it's, but you seem to leave a window open that the government could do a lot to educate people. So for example, would you say that the appropriate that, say we put the Bible in schools or display the Ten Commandments in, public spaces, or that the government promote, the one true religion as, it does not coerce people to follow it, it does not fine them or force them to go to church, but that it's much more emphatically pro-religion. I mean, why would that be part of what the founders intended?
So you have two levels here. One is what the government can't do on account of our natural right to liberty. And that's a longer conversation, but the end result of that conversation is you cannot coerce religious belief or punish lack of belief or lack of practice. Okay. But as we just talked about, that leads to all sorts of things. Can you put the Ten Commandments? Can you have religious instruction. It used to be very common in public schools. You would have the Catholic kids in the public schools would get an hour of religious instruction from the Catholic priest, the Protestant from a Protestant minister, the Jewish kids from a Jewish rabbi. This was extraordinary. This was all common until the Supreme Court struck it down in 1948. You could do all of that consistent with the natural right. Whether you should do it is a matter of prudence. So there are some things you can't do. It leaves lots of freedoms what you could do. But whether it's wise to do it or not, is it wise to put the 10 Commandments up in every public school classroom in Texas? I personally, I think probably not. But you could have an argument about it. And an argument for me that, look, if the people of some town want to do that, it's their schools. Right? Could you have a system of education like they used to have religious education in the public schools, where you have different denominations come in an hour in the school day? I probably wouldn't favor it myself, but if that's what the people want, right? So most of these questions are prudential questions that's left to politics. Now, there's a couple. The reason we have federalism, and even federalism within a state, subsidiarity, local control of schools, is so the public schools reflect the public in that area. So if you want the 10 Commandments in some schools, but not in other school districts, or Texas wants to do something different from Massachusetts or whatever, that's all part of our system. But these questions are just questions of prudence. And here, this is exactly where the founders started to disagree on these prudential questions in terms of funding of religion. Right? It's just going to depend on circumstances.
So would you say that the there's particular disagreement, would you say the founders did not, would you say that they believed it was imprudent to promote religion because they didn't think it would be effective, or because they believed that this was something up to each individual's choice and the government shouldn't promote anything?
No, they certainly agreed that you couldn't use the law to coerce religion. They all agreed on that. Whether you could use government funding or grants of land to promote religion, most of them actually thought it was fine. But some had reservations, but on prudential grounds, not on principled grounds.
Yeah, thanks for the that's sort of the prelude question. We use religion generally in basically this entire thing.
Yeah.
Is it Christianity, do you think that these founders, that they think their natural theology is compatible?
The answer is certainly yes, but I don't know that it's necessarily just Christianity.
Okay, so
Yeah.
my question is, it seems to me that the natural theology you spell out regarding the question of true devotion has some problems with, you might say, sort of just the revealed text of Christianity. And that in your interaction with Professor Stauffer, it's clear that the coercion that is a problem when we're talking about human matters is not that someone comes to your house and puts their hands together and makes you pray. Right, but the coercion is the presence of a threat that hangs over you that says you will be harmed, and perhaps immediately harmed, if you do not show this devotion towards being. Human beings are capable of freely, totally devoting themselves to being. And therefore, in turning us to thinking about God, it seems that God would want us to do that for him, freely devote ourselves. The problem is that it seems in Christian scripture there's a pretty big threat hanging over those who can devote themselves to God but do not. The threat of hellfire. A bigger threat than any one individual merely earthly authority. And so that would seem to suggest the picture of the natural theology would seem to suggest a God incompatible with our purpose.
Well, I'll leave that to God. I'm not so sure that follows, right? It depends on what you have an implicit assumption on what rewards and what punishments are. That's guiding everything. So if the punishment of rejecting God is you just don't get to be with God, is that a punishment? Or are you getting what you asked for? Yeah, but what is that? You're separated from the divine. So I think the question is actually much more complicated. But if I understand your question, you seem to be pointing out a just God couldn't do this. That's the underlying direction of the question. But that's not clear to me, because it's not clear to me that the punishments or rewards are actually unjust, given what the punishments and rewards actually are.
But my question, no, I think my question is not so much about justice of God exactly, but rather whether the implication that they draw, that you say the founders draw from the human capacity to fully devote oneself in admiration and love to another being, would be compatible with even the proclamation of punishment for not devoting himself. I would not suggest that God would have to present himself as a sort of liberal ruler.
Well, maybe it's the language of punishment that is confusing. I mean, think of it in terms of an invitation to get married. Are you punished if you say, well, if you don't marry me, you don't get the benefits of marriage? You can accept the invitation or not. It's not a punishment. Oh, if you don't want to get married, then you don't have to get married.
That doesn't seem to me to fit. It's not as though
I mean, I think that's more like,
have or not have original sin that states us that we seek salvation. That's precisely out of our hands.
fair enough. I don't know that I can answer that question. I don't know that I can resolve the doctrine of original sin. Yeah. But we'd have to say, I'd just say, we'd have to know more about what it means to have original sin. I mean, that itself is quite complicated. I mean, isn't the punishment for original sin that we die? Is that unjust that we die? So I just say there's a lot more you'd have to work through on this. Okay.
This is my final question. I have
It's fine. Yeah.
I noticed on Revolution number 3 about the role of post-religious authority and how that's a living factor of government. I will say, I actually agree with you that the founders did face a lot of their natural rights that they interpreted as what is needed for this brand new great experiment for the world. I do agree on that. However, I noticed at the very bottom, you say the government job is not to ensure secularism, but a religious liberty. And for that, I kind of got a little bit, I guess, doubtful. Reason being, because at least in terms of contemporary society, especially when you brought up religious diversity, racial diversity, etc. If you look at, this century, 21st century, Lawrence v. Texas, how they did coercion in the name of faith. Sodomy was illegal. Sodomy is primarily an Abrahamic idea. So they legalized an entire practice of human interaction based in the name of faith, faith in mind. You go back to the 1920s.
I don't know that I can accept that premise, because I don't know that that's true. It might be true that some legislators thought that, but is that the only public justification? No, I mean, I think clearly not. So the premise of your question, I think, is, I mean, you could have anti-sodomy laws based on non-religious reasons.
Of course, then if you go back to the 60s and the 50s, those even governmental officials, religious officials who use religion to justify hate, like the KKK and radical Southern Baptists, who use their faith to justify the lynching of African Americans. Or even further back to the 1800s and 1900s, the usage of faith to coerce Native Americans to say either you're Christian or you're not American. So in that respect, yes, the founders in their time, their emphasis on religious liberty and not secularism was beneficial, could be argued beneficial, to the benefit of the country. But would you say in terms of contemporary should we now transfer, since times have changed, from these ancient classical thinkers from religious liberty to a secularized American society?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question and a good question to think about. I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is, I mean, who would you say is the greatest leader of the civil rights movement of the second half of the 20th century?
People would say MLK.
Yeah, Martin Luther King. The Reverend Martin Luther King. A movement deeply motivated by religion. So at least in my lifetime, I'm old enough to remember that, the tail end of that. In my lifetime, the greatest movement for good in America was deeply driven by religion. I don't know if we would have had that movement without it. You could certainly have the arguments without it, without a doubt. Would you have actually had the politics, the moral witness? Could Martin Luther King have been Martin Luther King without being a reverend? I mean, I can't answer that question. So I still think the idea of secularism is often taken to mean you can't have religious motivation for politics. And that, undoubtedly, there's been religious motivation for all sorts of injustice, without a doubt. But there's been religious motivation for all sorts of justice as well. Regardless, I don't think religious motivations, it certainly is not true to the spirit of the founding or American constitutionalism, that religious motivations make a policy illegitimate. The policy is legitimate or illegitimate based on its own grounds, not the motivation of those who advocated for it. The larger question, would we have better policy if we had less religion, or better policy if we had more religion? I mean, that's an empirical question, which I think there are actually good arguments on either side. I tend to follow Tocqueville, who thought religion tended to be a force for good, but that's, in a way, it's going to depend on what you think the political good is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.